Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I think we have about 10 or 11 people that have joined so far, so we're just going to give a couple more minutes for people to trickle in, and we'll get started just right after 2 p.m. Thank you for joining, everybody. We're just going to give it another minute or so. People are still trickling in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right. Well, thank you all for joining. My name is Mike Chiappa. I'm Director of Real Estate Development with the Arlington Partnership for Affordable Housing. I'm very pleased to moderate this panel on the other credits. We're going to try and cover three different sets of financing tools that are available to be used potentially for low-income housing projects. The first is state housing credits. We're going to talk a little bit about those in general, what other states have done, and some of the sort of things to be aware of there, and then get an update on the effort to create a Virginia state housing credit. We'll talk a little bit about opportunity zones and look at a case study there that was successfully developed or in process of being developed in Virginia. And then finally look at new market tax credits and the possibilities to incorporate those in a mixed use development or potentially some other ways to support housing. We will save questions on all three of those topics for the very end, but please feel free to add your questions at any time in the chat box or the Q&A box, and I'll be keeping an eye on those, and I'll raise those to the panelists at the very end. And want to start by introducing our panel. I'm joined by Adam Stockmaster, who's president of TM Associates, Bob Newman, who's president and CEO of VCDC, Jess Worthington, who is an attorney at Klein Hornig, and Chris Height, who is the president of Sugar Creek Capital. And let me start with you, Chris. If you don't mind, I wanted to dive into the state housing credit question. And I know that you have experience looking at these across a number of states. So could you give us, please, sort of an introduction and an overview to the state housing credit concept, what's worked and what hasn't, and any sort of suggestions you have for Virginia?
Sure. All right. Well, Sugar Creek is a state tax credit syndicator firm. We do have other businesses, but that's our primary business. We do generally about 60 deals a year where we're doing real estate that's throwing off state tax credits. We're making the investment, turning around, getting investors for the state credits that use them. Most of those deals are going to be low-income housing tax credits, LIHTC, and we're in usually about a dozen different states a year. And so over time, we've probably been in about 20 states. I'm going to start here. I'm going to try and share some slides with you, and I'm going to go quick if I can. All right. Are we live? Are you seeing my slides?
Almost.
Is that a yes? Okay.
There you go.
All right. Okay, so that's what I'm going to talk about today. Generally, I'm just going to talk about the national picture for state housing credits. Virginia has a very active effort to create a state housing credit. It would create a lot of deals for a lot of you that might be interested in doing deals in Virginia. I'm not going to get into that. That's Bob's bailiwick. He's the expert. He sat on the committee. I've dealt with it nationally, and I'll come from that perspective. First thing I want to do is kind of give you an idea of how the state credit works generally in the instances we've seen it. There's all kinds. There's certificates, there's allocated credits, but most of the states are dealing with an allocated credit where you've got a project partnership. The project partnership receives a state credit. The state credit ends up allocated to a state limited partner. And so that's what this structure is thrown up here. The state investor only has 1% of the deal. So, and you might have 0.01%. About half the deals we do is about 0.01. And you'll see there's very little cash flow, there's very little back end, there's very little economic reasons to do the deal other than the state credit, because you're getting 100% of the state credits, but really only 1% of any other economic benefit. So that comes into play with the tax questions, and we won't worry about that right now. But what it does mean is you've got two investors in a deal. So you've got a federal investor and a state investor. And the lawyers would kill us all if we actually acted like we had two investors in the deal. What we figured out is the state investors, all the people that are in my industry, model their terms after the federal. So you set your stabilization requirements or your developer fee payouts, whatever. That's going to be your federal syndicator, your federal investor that calls the shots on that. And as long as it's within market, the state investor is going to follow right alongside. Same due diligence list, those sorts of things. So that's how it works for those of you that haven't done a state credit deal. All right, so a federal tax credit versus a state, you'll know the pricing is different. I'll talk in terms of a 10-year credit. That's the same as a federal credit. It's a 10-year. As we know, they rarely come over 10 years, but we'll talk that way. You get a federal tax credit, dollar reduction in your federal tax liability. State tax credit works the exact same way. The one difference is when you take a federal tax credit, it just takes $1 off. When you take a state tax credit, it takes $1 off your state return, but you're going to reduce your state liability, not pay it. And so when you reduce that state liability, then you lose the deduction you would have already received for paying your state taxes. And if you're at a 21% corporate rate, that's 21%. It's just gone. So it seems inefficient, except at the end of the day, you've got this big capital account. And this capital account, say you put $2 million in a deal. And say the deal has proceeds from sale or refinance. You've got that $2 million you've got to pay off because capital accounts go first. Usually, and I mean like every single deal we've done, that doesn't happen. Usually the state investor sells their interest for the value of a 1% or 0.01% interest in a rent restricted deal, which ain't much. So if that's the case, you're going to get a big capital loss equal to the amount of your capital account, or pretty much equal to it. So you get most of that 21 cents back at the back end. And that's the way the market's been run in the last few years. I don't want to jump ahead yet. The other thing I want to get into is pricing difference. So you might think of a 10-year credit worth 60 something cents and on the state side, maybe worth 90 something cents on the federal. So what's the difference in that 30 cents there? Well, that depreciation, you're getting losses with the federal credit. And that's real tax savings. That's a real tax benefit. Plus there's some cash. And you're also going to have a potential at year 15 to say, yeah, we're going to still be in this deal, maybe get some proceeds there. And the key is you've got control. So those things mean you get a little bit higher yield if you're going to be a state credit investor because you don't have that control. You don't get those economic benefits. So you add those things up and that explains your differential. It's pretty similar yields we're seeing to federal and state, but the state yields are a little higher because you lack that control. But you don't get the economic benefits as a state investor for receiving the depreciation and the other cash. Rolling on through here. Now, why would a state give a state tax credit instead of a loan or a grant? And the answer is it's the most efficient way to do it. A loan, even if it's a soft loan, even if it's 0%, even if it's 40 years, eventually has to be repaid. And if you say, oh, it's going to be forgivable, and you make it too clear in the get-go, it's going to be a grant reclassed by the IRS. So a loan has to be shown as being repaid at some time. Sometimes you've got agencies that are very facile with soft loans. Or Virginia is facile with that. Sometimes you've got cities that do this and they're not, and then someone goes to forgive a soft loan and the politicians get mad. So there's sometimes some long-term headaches with loans. The other problem with the loan or grant is the state has to fund that money up front. So you don't have the warm body occupancy requirements that we have. So we've got to have every unit in a building occupied before we turn those state credits on. It's got to be occupied by a qualified tenant. Well, you do a loan, you're taking construction risk, you're taking lease up risk, you're taking some compliance risk. With a state credit, you're really not taking that risk. You're taking some fraud risk, but there's so many parties in these deals that that's awful minimal. So there's a little difference there. The other difference is you think about the dollar versus the 60 cents. Well, that's just time value of money. A state does a hospital bond or something, a highway bond or something. They spread those out and they're going to have an interest rate. And so they may borrow, 60 cents, but they'll pay back $1. So it's similar. You're going to have lower interest at a bond than you would a state credit discount rate because you've got a deed of trust and you've got the state's probably general obligation backing it. Here you've got basically an unsecured loan, if you looked at it economically, where the state investor just puts in money and hopes to get the state credit back if the deal completes construction and the lease is up. So trying to wrap that up in a hurry, but bottom line is a state credit is a lot like a federal credit. It's more efficient than a loan because it doesn't have to be paid back, and it's better than a grant because the grant's taxable. You've got a 99% for-profit partner in every one of your LIHTC deals, and they want credits, so they don't want a reduction in basis. So because we're governed by the federal tax code in the LIHTC program, a state credit is going to be more efficient to supplement a LIHTC deal than a state-funded loan or grant. So that's why states do state credits. Now, from going out on the trail and working with politicians and bureaucrats and other folks that have really worked hard in their states to help affordable housing happen, I can tell you there's things you shouldn't say and there's things you should say. Some of the things that we've seen are sort of generic concepts given any tax credit program that's proposed, and they don't really work in our industry because of the long-term nature of our investments. Federal credit's got a 15-year compliance period. State credit, if you match the credit period, is going to be a 10-year plus credit period. Well, you don't want to sunset the deal and you don't want to put it to appropriations risk, because if you're going to throw those credits out over 10 years, you want investors to know that there's going to be credits awarded for those 10 years. And if you're going to sunset the deal, even if you say we're going to allow the awards to continue for 10 years, your problem will be you don't develop that investor base that's comfortable with your state credit. So you don't want that. You want competition. You want Sugar Creek competing with US Bank, competing with Raymond James, competing with whoever that might be interested in buying your credits, because you want the highest pricing for your taxpayer dollar. Because of that, you don't want to do some sort of market constraints. New Jersey did this weird deal on a credit they had where they had minimum pricing, and it couldn't work. The market couldn't pay it. So what did the market figure out? We'll do bridge loans. Just created a whole inefficiency that didn't need to be there. Other things, if you do a hard cap, say you do 20 million a year versus indexing to the federal credit, which is 20 million a year. Over time, that 20 million is going to seem a lot smaller. And they'll take a look at that and they'll say, oh, we can save 10 million here and cut that. If you index it to a federal cap, that federal cap has been growing with inflation and population growth over time. So you want to be indexed to that. It's important. Your housing needs aren't going to get smaller in the future. The cost of money is going to change, but the value of $1 in the future versus $1 now is going to be less. So you're better off to index to something that's growing than you are to put a hard cap in there. Redemption. I've been talking about this 10-year credit. It's really about a 12 to 14-year credit on a deal. It takes a year to build, year to lease up, plus you might have multiple buildings. In the start of a state credit deal, you've got to pass a QAP. All the developers have to respond to the QAP. You have to pick deals, and then you've got to close deals. Then you've got construction. Then you've got lease up. So sometimes you're 4 or 5 years before the first credit is redeemed. And that's important. When you're talking to a state, you want to make sure they understand there's zero fiscal impact for about 4 years. And then you're going to have some fiscal impact, but you'll have construction materials and income taxes and whatnot that'll offset that. You'll actually have positive fiscal impact for a few years. So it's not till about year 8 that a state has any real fiscal impact. If you start talking 60 cents on the dollar, you're dead. Because the state legislature is going to say that's a bad idea. And if your bond was getting 60 cents on the dollar, it'd be dead. They talk in terms of interest rates. You ought to talk in terms of yield. We see generally kind of a 5 to a 9% yield, depending on the market. Like Georgia, we're seeing higher yields, which equates to lower pricing because there's so many movie credits on the market. Oklahoma, where there's no movie credits, but a lot less robust economy than Georgia, we're seeing 10-cent higher pricing in Oklahoma than we see in Georgia. So you see different yields from different states. Virginia, we would expect to be a very low yield state, a very competitive state. So I would expect pricing is 65 cents, but I won't talk to a legislator that way. I'll say we expect investor yields to be somewhere around 5-6% because that's what we expect. And that's a real reflection on the way it works. Last thing, legislators are farmers and pharmacists and teachers and retirees. They are not tax attorneys. They don't understand allocations. They don't understand certificates. They don't understand, basis. In Virginia, you've got a smarter delegate than you have in most states with their representatives. You've got a good legislature, but they're still not tax attorneys. To try and design the perfect, I've tried to do that. I worked on that in Colorado, and then I tried to do it in Nebraska, and Nebraska couldn't figure it out, and I about shot myself in the foot. Now, there's people in Colorado and Nebraska leading the efforts, but I was the guy from out of town trying to structure it. So I thought, if we shorten this credit period, I can get a better pricing. It'll be great. It about cost us. I've learned in Arizona, where we were trying to tweak it just to make it a little bit better. And we were talking with a different group out there that was pushing it, and they had their ideas on how to make it a little bit better. In Arizona, the whole bill failed. We had the House signed up, we had the Senate signed up, and the governor was pretty close to signed up. And we couldn't get it out of the Senate because the two different groups were talking Greek to these legislators, and they just didn't understand it. So they set it aside. If you can just match that federal credit, which has good, robust political support across the spectrum, R's and D's, you can just match that credit, you've got a better chance at getting it through. Now, if you've got a strong sponsor and you've got a good understanding of how the program works, you can make tweaks to it. But I'll tell you, in my experience, if you try and do things like I've done, where you try and shorten the credit period, I like it a shorter credit period, you may not get her through. So that's my experience. I don't know, where it's going to go in Virginia. I know there's a proposed bill. I know there's Bob's talking about doing some other things. I'll let him talk about that. But just remember, they're not tax attorneys, with the exception of one tax attorney that I dealt with in Georgia a few years ago in 2008-9. Lady named Stacey Abrams. She turned out to be somebody, but pretty sharp tax attorney. The rest of them, not so much. So with that, I will conclude my slide sharing here, and happy to take any questions.
That's great. Thank you, Chris. I appreciate that. That's a really helpful overview of sort of the national projects that have been available. Bob, I wanted to turn to you and ask, I know that you've been more closely tied in with what is being proposed currently in Virginia. So let me hand it over to you and see if you can sort of bring this discussion down to the state level.
Sure, thank you. I learned a lot from seeing Chris's presentation. I think there's, more things that we can learn from him as we proceed down this path. But in the last General Assembly, Delegate Jeff Bourne had introduced and gotten passed HB 810, which was to establish a panel, task force to meet to determine the need for and maybe some of the recommendations for how to structure a state tax credit in a state housing tax credit in Virginia. And we got a little bit of a late start because of COVID. We didn't really get started until July 1st. We had to deliver a report to the governor by September 1st. So we met I think it was 5 or 6 times during the months of July and August. It was pretty intensive, but the report generally did identify the need for credit. Uh, Basically a need for more affordable housing, and identified a credit, state credit, as a good way to provide for that. There was a really clear consensus, this is consistent a bit with what Chris was saying, that there was a clear consensus that any new state credit program should track as in many ways as possible the federal credit. Certainly it should be administered by Virginia Housing through the QAP, and coordinated through the application process. Compliance should be done by Virginia Housing, et cetera. To the extent that there would be any additional targeting requirements or anything like that, if that gets if the point is, the recommendation is to not put anything like that into the legislation itself, but to allow the QAP to determine if and how to target the state credit, whether there's any additional, for instance, income targeting or geographic targeting or anything like that. We talked about 2 different kinds of credit, and Chris made a brief reference to the certificated credits, but the 2 kinds of credits that we looked at were an allocated credit, very similar to what Chris described. We also looked at certificated credits, which I'll take a minute to explain what that is. It's essentially awarded, it's for the benefit of a project, but it's not, whereas an allocated credit requires the taxpayer to be a member of or part of the ownership of the partnership in order to benefit from the credit. You saw Chris's little diagram of the ownership structure. That state credit investor couldn't take advantage of the state credits if it was not part of the ownership. That's not true for a certificated credit. A certificated credit is basically just a certificate that the holder of the certificate can sell to any taxpayer. If, by the way, if that sale of the credit, if the credit is held by, the certificate is held by a nonprofit entity, and the nonprofit entity sells that credit, the proceeds of that sale would not be a taxable event. So that makes, it provides an advantage that can help to get more money up front into the deal. It would be in the form of a deferred loan, probably, if that's the way it's typically structured. But I think that it could potentially get more money into the deal up front. Particularly, I think that for-profit or nonprofit developers could benefit from that kind of a structure, but probably more often it would be the nonprofit developers. Another advantage, I think, of certificated credits are that, again, you don't have to be a member of the partnership. You don't have to be a sophisticated real estate developer. You don't or investor. You don't have to go through an extensive closing process with a 100-page partnership agreement, and with all the costs that are associated with that. It could open the door to a much broader range of potential investors, potential purchasers of the credit. So Dominion Resources could buy the credit, Performance Food Group, Owens and Minor. These are, most of that most, not all, but I think most investors in the LIHTC, the federal LIHTC, are financial institutions, and that's really because of the incentives provided by the Community Reinvestment Act. The market for LIHTC is, the yields are, much lower, meaning the pricing is much higher because of the CRA. I think that this makes the market for the consumers of a certificate would be much broader, not necessarily with the same motivations as those kind of investors. I think that we would expect there to be a lot better pricing with the certificate than with the allocated credits for a variety of reasons. What I would hope as this makes its way through the process is that we could offer a program that could allow a choice between a allocated credit or a certificated credit. There are some states that do that already. California and Massachusetts being two that I'm aware of, and it seems to work pretty well. And sometimes an allocated credit makes more sense for a deal. Sometimes a certificated credit makes more sense, and allowing a process with more flexibility to choose one path or the other, I think is advantageous to everybody. So where we are, Delegate Bourne submitted earlier this week a draft bill to Legislative Services, so that for them to kind of get into shape to introduce in the general, and when the General Assembly opens. Right, the bill that was submitted to Legislative Services, there is the ability for it to get modified or shaped between now and the start of the General Assembly. But it's pretty much right now drafted as an allocated credit. I think that there are some potential obstacles. I think Chris made a few mentions of kind of bumps in the road or obstacles that you could anticipate in the legislative process. In Virginia, we have I think this is probably the most minor obstacle probably, but we have the need potentially to explain to some legislators why we just took a state housing credit off the books. It was enacted back in the mid-90s. It wasn't really used very much. The primary reason it wasn't used was it couldn't be specially allocated in the way that would allow for the state investor to basically get the benefits directly and in the way that it was diagrammed. I think that that's easy enough to explain, that there were some disadvantages to how that was structured, and that this we've learned a lot from that and kind of designed this program around that. The obvious obstacle is the fiscal constraints. This is everybody's been burning through money trying to cover additional costs related to the coronavirus and all kinds of additional strains and stresses, and the economic strains. State budget is not as robust and is not expected to be as robust in the future with resources. That's going to be a challenge. This is a arcane challenge that I just recently learned about, but apparently there's either a tradition or some arcane reason that I'm not aware of that new tax credits are generally introduced in even years, not odd years. And for whatever reason that is, that makes trying to introduce this credit in 2021 a different challenge. I guess the other thing is, in Virginia, there's not much precedent for. In fact, there's a lot of resistance, historic resistance to long-term multiple year allocations. And so something that proposes a 10-year allocation, I'd be all in favor of doing that. That would generate a lot of stability, a lot of, resources, but it is a lot of resources. It's also something that the General Assembly is reluctant to obligate future General Assemblies for, those kind of costs. So I think that's a big challenge to face too. So the Housing Alliance, Virginia Housing Alliance, and I don't want to speak for the home builders, but I know that they're supportive of this bill too. If you want to help to advocate for this, kind of stay tuned to one of those two organizations or both, and they can kind of track it and keep they'll be advocating for and alerting people about when there are opportunities for trying to advocate. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Bob. Really, really helpful and exciting to see that this might really come to fruition in Virginia. So I invite our audience to submit any questions they have on state credits generally or in Virginia specifically in the chat box, and we will circle back to those, but I want to keep our discussion moving. And I'll turn it over to Adam to talk us through opportunity zones and a case study for a project that he recently closed.
Thank you, Mike. And first and foremost, I appreciate being invited today to speak at this conference for the Virginia Housing Alliance. We've been very active owner, developers, and managers of apartment communities in the Commonwealth of Virginia for decades now. And it's great to speak today about the opportunity zone. And I heard my colleagues on the panel here speak of the credits, and yes, credits need to be monetized, and that's how they bring a source to a project. The opportunity zone is not really a credit. Rather, it's a financial mechanism that provides for tax savings, and those tax savings over time is ultimately what provides the willingness of the investor to establish the opportunity zone fund, which must be the opportunity zone investor in any kind of opportunity zone project. So I'd like today to speak about a project in the Commonwealth of Virginia that, yes, we have closed on. We have purchased the real estate, and we are working to close early next year after we get site plan approval with our construction lender and tax credit investor. Allow me a moment to share my screen. So the Coyle Apartments is a 2-building, 62-unit apartment community that's being built in Newport News within the Shipyards neighborhood. One of the many unique things of the Coyle Apartments is it's actually 2 apartment buildings. It's on a scattered site. And what that allows us to do is it brings some real innovation to this property. So I'll speak to that real brief before I start the slideshow. This property and this project has 2 very innovative applications that are being used in order to test both energy efficiency over a long period of time, as well as flexibility with unit types. So the first innovative approach that we are applying with the Coyle Apartments is, having developed over 100 apartment communities in the last 2 decades with tax credits, I'll be the first to admit I have not always had the perfect unit mix. And in that case, I'd love to have more 2s or maybe more 1s or less 3s or whatever the situation may be. So at the Coyle Apartments, we have units which are adaptable. And by that, I mean they share bedrooms. So we could have 2 2s, a 1 and a 3, or it could just be 2 1s. So, having the ability to adjust the unit mix is very important and very innovative, and something which was well received by Virginia Housing and a concept we look forward to implementing. The second unique aspect of the Coyle is having 2 31-unit buildings that are identical in design being built at the same time allows us to test construction methods. So we are partnering with Virginia Tech, and they will be monitoring the construction of each of the 2 sites. One of them will be panel modular construction, utilizing an insulated panel product, and the other will be conventional frame built. So we look to test the efficiencies of the conventional versus modular with the insulated foam. And then we also look to test the efficiencies of how fast it could go up, modular versus framing, and some of the savings that can be recognized there. So this is the first of the 2 buildings at the Coyle. The buildings, again, are identical in design. This is our latest rendering of what the community will look like. We've got common community space on the roof, as this is an urban infill location. These are the 2 sites that make up the Coyle. They're about 4 blocks apart geographically. It's well less than a quarter mile to walk between the 2 properties. And what sits there today are 2 parking lots. In fact, what sits in almost the entire Shipyard neighborhood of the city of Newport News is an ocean of asphalt. Well, we felt that that is not the best and highest use, and that housing ought to be where the jobs are, which is in the Shipyards neighborhood. So we are converting 2 parking lots and making them into this wonderful affordable housing community we have planned. The opportunity zone brought an additional equity source to the project. So unlike the state credit or the new market credit or the low income housing tax credit, which we've had to monetize by bringing in investors, here we're bringing in an investor that's providing cash into the project. It's not a loan, it's not a grant, it's not a credit, it is equity. So we had to, again, identify an opportunity zone fund that was interested in the COIL. And our capital stack looks like a lot of regular capital stacks insofar as we've got our tax credit equity, and we have a grant, or actually 2 grants from the Federal Home Loan Bank and a permanent loan contemplated from Virginia Housing. The opportunity zone is the equity component, but what the opportunity zone equity allowed us to do here, which is very critical, was it allowed us to purchase the property. So we had a very time-sensitive seller. We received our award in October, and we closed in December. So we had to perform very fast, and we found an opportunity zone investor that was interested. And who might that opportunity zone investor be? It's actually our company. And by that, I mean TM Associates formed an opportunity zone fund. And we established this fund from the sales proceeds of another affordable housing community located in the Commonwealth of Virginia. We took a portion of the proceeds from that sale and purchased the property. That established our OZ investment, and we closed on that. It was at the end of 2019, literally within the last week of the year. So the opportunity zone investment, to speak to the economic benefit, is we were able and are able now to shelter the gain, which we would otherwise recognize from the sale of this apartment community, which occurred in 2018. Now we have pushed that liability to year 7, and it is contemplated in our model that we'll have about a $200,000 tax liability associated with the gain. So right now you'd say this is a terrible investment. You're putting $1 million in, and then you're paying $200,000 for what? Well, the for what is our investment allows us to sit in the partnership as an investment limited partner. So we will receive, just as you saw in some of the earlier models. In fact, I think it was Chris's model highlighted how the state investor purchased 1%. Our $1 million opportunity zone investment in the equity position for this property is translating to about a 12% investment limited partner interest. So we have sold the other 87.99 to a normal regular tax credit investor who's providing the construction loan as well as the tax credit equity for this project. And we will be receiving, just as our tax credit investor has after it's complete and stabilized and running the way it should, 12% of the interest, depreciation, and the credits, as well as 12% of the asset management fee. So we looked at what that stream of benefits were. And as real estate tax professionals, we are able to capitalize on those through tax savings. And with that, our investment, we feel, is going to pay out. We won't really know until year 16, when we are at the point of identifying and recognizing a capital gain, and then we will know for sure how that is treated. So the opportunity zone, while it's a great idea, and the legislation that was introduced in 2017 really has brought a lot of investment into the opportunity zone areas. I think all opportunity zone investors are doing this with a little bit of a leap of faith, as no one really knows until the end how the capital gains will be treated. But what I do know is we purchased 2 parking lots, and in 17 years, there will be 2 beautiful apartment buildings. So I am confident that this will be a success. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Adam. That's a nice case study. And I think really the first one I've seen certainly in Virginia that uses opportunity zones paired with LIHTC. So it's really exciting to see that, come to fruition for what I think is the first time. So thank you. Please keep your questions coming. We're keeping an eye on the chat, and we'll raise those to the panelists at the end. One final topic that we wanted to cover before we turn to Q&A is new market tax credits, and I want to turn it over to Jess Worthington.
Thanks, Mike. I have some slides to share as well. I think just to give a little more introduction on Klein Hornig, we're a firm that focuses on affordable housing and community development. So we work on a lot of LIHTC projects, but also new markets, historic, state historic, and state LIHTC. Mostly representing affordable housing developers, probably about 70% of what we do, and then 30% being either lenders or investors. So let me start my sharing my screen. Okay, great. So as Mike mentioned, this is a presentation on new markets, tax credits, and how you can use them on affordable housing deals or with LIHTC. I think just to kind of get started to talk a little bit about new market versus low-income housing tax credits, since most folks on this call have used those in their deals. The new market tax credits are dollar for dollar tax credit earned on equity investments. Like the 9% credit, they're limited in availability and allocated to intermediaries that select the projects. You know, LIHTCs for 9% are allocated to state agencies. New markets are allocated to private group, which is a a CDE. Unlike LIHTCs, the equity is not invested directly into the project. They are leveraged and then loaned into the project. So for the CDE, QEI, all the alphabet soup that comes with new markets. I have a definition here with some of the key terms that are generally used for the new market tax credit program. So the investment in a CDE is called a qualified equity investment. It's made by the investor in the CDE lender who uses the proceeds to make a loan into the QualiB, which is a qualified active low-income business, which is located in a low-income community. So this is just some terms to kind of talk about the secondary nature of the credit. So you have the investment for LIHTCs is generally made directly into the project, and the credits are given to the investor that way or transferred to the investor that way. With a new markets tax credit, you have the CDE who gets the investment, and the credits are transferred at that level. But there are requirements for the CDE to make the loan into a qualified project. Most of these QLICs or qualified low-income community investments take the form of a loan with below market interest rates and flexible terms, with some loan forgiveness at the end of the 7-year compliance period. The CDEs are organizations that have a primary mission of serving low-income communities. They're designated by the CDFI fund. The CDEs apply through the CDFI fund to receive allocation, which they then divide among different projects. The investor receives the credits from the investment in the CDE, and the credits are taken over a 7-year period, 5% in the first 3 years and 6% in the remaining 4 years, for a total of 39% of their investment. One of the common misunderstandings of new markets is that you can't use it for housing projects, but you can. You can use it for mixed use development. You don't want your project to be depreciated as residential rental property, but if 20% or more of the project is generating commercial revenue, you can get out of that category. You can also have your developer be a QualiB if you have some sort of workforce housing. And you could also use it for sale housing, condo sales in an area with naturally occurring affordable housing. But what comes up often is how to use new market tax credits and low-income housing tax credits. And they can be used together, sort of. The important thing to do when you have new markets on a LIHTC project is to separate the real estate structure. So you'll want to have some sort of condo regime or separate but adjacent structures or air rights parcels in some states. And that the new markets component should really be a strong piece of the project and not really just a gap filler, since the structure is complicated and there is pain involved in adding this type of financing. Some of the things to think about if you have a New Markets LIHTC project is to have separate documentation and plans, but make sure that those are coordinated. Make sure that construction schedules are coordinated, and that you know when each project will be available for its intended use. The projects may be separate, but the financing parties may be interested in when the other project will come online, especially if you have commercial on the first floor of an affordable housing deal. If it's possible to use the same investor and lender for both credits, that's great. Makes it easier to underwrite. If it's not possible, coordinate the details of the collateral, cross defaults, project schedule up front, and consider some sort of joint development agreement when appropriate. Some sample projects that we've seen, Klein Hornig, are, when I talk about having separate buildings, you'll have an existing, this case was a historic building that qualifies, it's in a qualified census zone, which allows it to get a QUILICI and be a Qualic B. And so it was financed with both New Markets and historic, and the affordable housing was built behind it, but incorporating the historic building. We've also seen historic theaters that the city has required the affordable housing developer to redevelop at the same time as affordable housing to redevelop a block of the city. So that's one way to do it. Another way that we commonly see it is if you have first floor retail in an affordable housing project, you would condo the building so that the first floor retail would be a New Markets project and the upper tiers of the building would be a LIHTC project. And then you have some of those really complicated and fun projects where you have New Markets historic, LIHTC, state historic, and maybe even state LIHTC, like this project, which incorporated a historic building, but then other buildings within the same block using a condo regime. So just some ideas and sample New Markets community components, community kitchens, charter schools, community clinics, grocery stores, warehouse and food distribution centers, gyms or community centers, retail. These can really be helpful when you're looking at a community as a whole and trying to offer affordable housing, but also services that serve that community. I was looking at some of the CDFI fund recommendations for underwriting for leverage lenders on New Markets deals. And it really seemed like there were some advantages for affordable housing developers. One thing the CDFI fund says to look at is the character integrity of the Qualic B. Will they pay back their debt? On a lot of these projects, a nonprofit developer, or even just a nonprofit that needs to rehabilitate their building, or somebody who's never kind of worked in this area before, isn't a developer, gets involved. And so you have to think about whether or not they'll pay back their debt and whether they have some sort of community reputation that makes them a good Qualic B. And affordable housing developers already have that advantage since they have existing reputations in the community. Having the capacity to manage the project, affordable housing developers already are adept at managing projects and providing reporting requirements. New Markets projects require annual reporting, and I think that's something other projects see from other financing sources. Need, is it true that this project would not be possible but for the New Markets? The New Markets tax credit program requires a but-for test to show that the New Markets tax credits were required for the project to be completed. Affordable housing developers are already working in low-income communities that need every advantage to bring new community services. So I think it's an easy test for affordable housing developers to show. And then longevity. There's a 7-year compliance period, so it's good to have a project that will be a project partner that will be around for a while. And since affordable housing developers are used to a 15-year compliance period with LIHTC, they're used to sticking with long-term projects. All right, I can stop sharing. And so that's what I have to say about New Markets. So if anyone has any further questions, I'm happy to answer those.
Awesome. Thanks, Jess. I appreciate it. And we'll dive straight into the Q&A because we got a couple of questions related to New Markets credits. So the first is, can you give us sort of an overview of the landscape for using New Markets credits with affordable housing, just kind of a general sense of What's the availability of organizations that are qualified in different parts of Virginia in particular? How many projects tend to use this kind of structure? It's kind of that general overview.
Yeah, sure. I mean, they're used all over the country. And I think the New Markets program is interesting because, it's really about, finding a consultant or finding a CD that's looking for your type of project, and they want to see community impact. And I think a lot of affordable housing developers who are doing a commercial component or a community component can show that. For specific, I can't think right now of the specific projects in Virginia, but I know that there are them. So I can get some examples to somebody who's interested in the project.
Great. And then the second question on New Markets in particular is, are investors looking at New Markets credits, especially paired with housing, differently during COVID? And how has the underwriting changed based on sort of the commercial portion of the income?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've seen on the New Market and on the historic side, commercial projects have even, changed their scope midstream and become housing instead of hotels, just because that is a better use of the space and more likely to bring in revenue. So I think you would still need to show that the project can generate revenue. I mean, I'm working on a theater project right now that has New Market tax credits, and the theater is a hard asset to show, during COVID that there'll be revenue coming. But I think folks are just projecting past the construction period and expecting that things will be different in a year from now.
Great. Changing topics, Bob, question for you on the Virginia State Housing Credit. Have any counties advocated for the state credit in their 2021 legislative agendas?
I am not aware of any counties that have done that. I would imagine that the city of Richmond would have it in its legislative agenda, just because of Delegate Bourne's close relationship to the folks here in Richmond. I think it's a great strategy to try to influence that. I don't know if it's too late to bring that into the conversation, but I would think that anybody locally who wants to promote this, wants to encourage this to be successful, should start talking to their localities about their legislative packages. That's a great idea.
Great, thank you. And Chris, a question I had for you. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the pricing on state credits and how it varies among states, and what's driving the difference between pricing, in one state versus another?
In most states, you've got a similar investor base, big corporations. You've also got some high net worth individuals, but usually you don't lack for investors. Georgia, you get a little soft because of that movie credit. They've got about 500 million to $1 billion in movie credits coming out in a year. So that softens it up a little bit, but most places you don't. So you're seeing those yields for an established credit. People understand it somewhere around 5%. On a 1-year credit, you're going to get in the 90s. On a 10-year credit, you're going to get in the 60s. And so that's about the best you're going to see. I think we've seen 65, 68 has been the highest I've seen on the 10-year. And then for certificates, generally they're 1 year. So generally you're going to see somewhere, I mean, we've done some Virginia deals, Mike, we did one with you this year, where we did a Virginia historic deal. And it's an allocated credit, but it's treated as a sale, which is a certificate. So there you usually see somewhere in the 80s. And that's kind of your range. Because of Virginia's weird little income thing, you see a little less on the net at the end of the day. But that's usually a 1-year credit's going to be mid to high 80s to low 90s, and you're going to see a 10-year somewhere in the 60s.
Great, got it. And sort of a follow-up to that, can you talk a little bit about the difference between allocated and certificated, and what are the advantages to the allocated credit?
Well, a certificate is a sale. So I've got a piece of paper from the state that says you get to take $1 off your taxes. I'm going to pay property for that piece of paper. I'm going to attach it to my tax return. I've therefore satisfied my state tax liability with something I can deduct off of my federal tax return. Allocated credit reduces your tax liability. You lose that deduction, but you make it up at the end. So a little iffy stuff there on tax law, but I'm trying to summarize. The bottom line is it looks like a certificated's higher, and it is if it's coming from a nonprofit, but if it's coming from a for-profit, you've got a taxable income. You've got zero basis when you sell that certificate. So if you sell that certificate for 90 cents, you've got 90 cents of income. So that's the challenge there, and people structure around it. But the biggest difference between the 1 year and the 10-year because of this capital loss issue is really the time value of money. And if you've got a $2 million credit in 1 year and you get 80 cents for it, but you get $2 million times 10 years and you get 60 cents for that, 60 cents is a lot more money. So that's kind of where you see it. Now, Bob got a point. You start coming out and you start talking about, oh my gosh, this program's going to be this big and this big, you know, in 20 years, it's going to be huge. You're dead in the water. But I'll tell you, the state of Virginia has got a $68 billion budget in 1 year. You take that times 10, it's 680. 14 years ago, it was 32. It doubled. So what happens is money grows over time. And the same things happen with state budgets. And that's why you've been able to keep them in other states. Missouri, we had a political issue, but other states like Colorado doubled theirs in a mature program. So once they see what you all build, how can you not support this program? We're changing people's lives. It's a direct impact. You don't have the bureaucracy, it's private dollars. So you've got to get people out to your groundbreakings. You got to have them meet your residents and say, where'd you used to live? Ask that question. And when they hear the answer, they say, we need more of this. Every single time. It's a good program. And so you get the support for it over time.
Great. Thank you. Adam, a follow-up question for you. On the opportunity zones, do you think, sort of having closed on that project now, that it was worth the additional complexity that was involved, and would you do it again?
So two things on that. Would we do it again? Yes. Was the complexity any harder than securing a construction loan to acquire the property, which we would have otherwise done? It wasn't that much of more of a lift. It did require negotiating through some items in the operating agreement, so it brought some heavier front-end legal work with it. But the bigger thing is with the opportunity zone, there was a real benefit to taking title to property that expired on 12/31/19. So some of the benefits, and you'll see in my model that it had a 7-year payback for the tax liability on the gain recognized back in 2018, that period is now shortened. So as the legislation started in 17 and carries to 2025, if you step in year 20 or 21, you've only got 4 years left. So they don't, start a new 7-year period for that OZ investment. And that kind of deflated the value. But based on our models, we believe the return would still be there, even with that little component taken away.
Great. I think we're down to the last couple of minutes. So I just wanted to do sort of a quick round robin among all four of you. What is sort of the one thing that you would like developers to take away from the discussions and the points that you've brought up today? What's sort of the one thing you want developers to know and to walk away with? And Chris, let me start with you.
Virginia passes a state credit. Instead of doing maybe 1 deal a year, you're going to do 2. You're going to house a lot more people.
Great. Bob?
I was going to say something similar. It's, there's a demonstrated need for more resources for affordable housing development. And I think the time, I think in many ways the time is right to be proposing more resources. I think a lot of things that we've been through over the last year just kind of highlight some of the needs and maybe even make some of them greater. And despite some fiscal challenges that might get in the way, I think that that's really the time to address these kind of needs.
Adam?
I would like to say that I think all the developers that are listening today should, keep doing everything that you're doing because affordable housing is so needed. And, to that extent, we explored a new tool and it worked within our model for our project. And it sounds to me like the state credit will be hugely beneficial in the Commonwealth of Virginia if it's in fact put in place as it has been in the past. And, it's going to take a lot, and it's very difficult to develop affordable housing and to provide units with rents at half of market rents, but we all do it for the cause. And with that, I think we all just have to keep doing the hard work, and hopefully more new tools will be added to our toolbox to make projects feasible.
Great. And Jess?
Yeah, I think I would say that, affordable housing developers are in a particularly good position to take advantage of new tools like the new markets tax credit. Not that that's a new tool, but because they work in the low income communities already and see the need and see the projects that need to be completed.
Great.
One thing, Mike, I want to thank Lou Basso. He's down there working. I know he's met with Bob and other people, and he's hiring lobbyists, and we're going to try and support this effort. And so you guys will see him in Virginia, but he's been working his tail off. So thank you to Lou Basso.
Excellent.
And thank you, Mike. You did a great job.
Thank you all. This has been a great panel. Appreciate you doing this virtually with us for the first time, and hopefully we will be in person next year for the 2021 conference. Brian, any closing remarks?
Yes, thank you all. Really great conversation, and we look forward to going full in this year and seeing if we can't get a tax credit program stood up at the General Assembly. I do want to just take a moment to thank all of our sponsors again. All of the team at Virginia Housing, Susan Dewey and her team, thank you for all of your support. The team, Eric Johnston and his team at Department of Housing Community Development, all of the panelists, all of the folks that attended over the last 2 days. I hope that it was a informative conference. Bit of a departure for us. We're going to figure out what we're going to do next year. Planning for these things is never fun in these uncertain times, but super appreciative of all of your everyone's time and energy in supporting us and this conference. And I was told that we have exhibit hall challenge winners that I need to announce. So in third place, Diana Carter. In second place, Stephanie Flanders. And in first place, Raynette Boone. And so we will be contacting the three of you all and getting your prizes out here ASAP. So is there anything else from any of you all?
What's the prize?
I was just told, so we're doing 3 Visa gift cards. First place is $250, and then they go down from there. I wish I'd known. I'd have played.
Very nice.
Jess, I don't know how Ron Swanson's going to feel about you pitching those new market tax credits. I don't know if anybody's caught that she's got the Parks and Rec background going. That is awesome.
As long as there's some parks nearby.
Yeah, that's good.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys. Really appreciate all of your time. To the audience, thank you for participating as well. And look forward to seeing you all at the next conference.
Yes. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.